In Chapter 15, we're moving on to talk about the perfect and the pluperfect indicative verb. Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's remind ourselves about this terminology. What do we mean when we say indicative? Well, that is the mood of the verb. And remember, the mood of the verb is where the speaker or the writer has marked the verb in such a way that they're showing how they think that action relates to reality, right? There's the action the speaker or the writer is speaking about. How do they think it relates to reality? Or how are they presenting it, maybe would be more accurate. How are they presenting that action's relationship to reality? And with the indicative mood, the verb is being presented just as a factual report. This is happening, or this will happen, or this did happen, right? Now, a speaker theoretically can be lying, but they're presenting something as a factual report. What are we talking about with the perfect or pluperfect, with that term? Well, that term is the tense, right? The tense. And remember, in Greek, tense is made up of verbal aspect, right? That's the speaker's presentation of the action, and is made up of time. Time is very little. Now, time is objectively there still with the indicative mood. Once we get outside the indicative mood, objective time present in the verbal form disappears, and time is then communicated by literary context. But at least in the indicative, right? At least in the indicative, which we're talking about now, there still is time. Time is sort of a secondary or a smaller element of that. We've been doing the Greek verbal system for a while now, and we're coming to the end of the indicative verbs. The final of the 5 main tenses is the perfect, and then we're going to briefly mention the 6th tense, the pluperfect. But let's chart these out again: past, present, and future, as we've been doing with each one of these tenses. Remembering, of course, that this actual past, present, future is a secondary element in the verb. But for us as English speakers, we primarily, when we say tense, we think time. But that was a secondary element in the actual what the indicative tenses are conveying. They're primarily conveying verbal aspect, right? So we learned the present active indicative and the present middle passive indicative. We learned that's one tense, the present tense, right? But we learned those two paradigms, and we saw that conveyed this sort of progressive perspective in the present, or the technical term for that is imperfective aspect, right? Imperfective aspect is that progressive idea, right? I am loosing. I'll just write that there. I am loosing. Realize it's not always going to be rendered that way, but that's a little gloss for us. The future we saw as more of a holistic perspective, looking at the action from beginning to ending and everything in between. And like, for example, I will loose, right? Just that's going to happen. And that the technical term for action conveyed in this way is perfective, right? It's perfective aspect, perfective verbal aspect. Now, we realize sometimes that language is a little confusing because there's a perfect tense too, but that is the technical and common scholarly way of referring to that. Sometimes students say, well, can I think about this like just a holistic perspective? Yeah, that's great. Can I think about this as a progressive perspective? Yeah, that's fine too. But if you're reading the best monographs and scholarly studies and commentaries, you do want to be familiar with this terminology: imperfective aspect, right, unfolding, and perfective aspect, looking at it as a whole, beginning, ending, everything in between. In the past, so we have 5 main tenses. So one of those is the present, and then one of those is the future. And within the future, just remember, we learned the future active indicative paradigm, the future middle indicative paradigm, and the future passive indicative paradigm, right? There were just 3 distinct paradigms, as opposed to the present. There was one paradigm for the middle passive where they shared endings, and context let us know whether it was middle or passive. But the future had a distinctively passive, distinctively middle, distinctively active, okay? Now, in the past tense, we had the imperfect, right? The imperfect active indicative and the imperfect middle passive indicative, right? That's where we had 2 paradigms, and one of them had the shared middle and passive forms, and context determined that. That was progressive action, progressive perspective, that imperfective aspect, right? It's fitting that an imperfect tense has imperfective aspect, right? And we gave a little gloss. I was loosing, right? I was loosing. All that together is the imperfect. So progressive action in the past, imperfective aspect in the past. We also learned the aorist, right? And with the aorist, we had the aorist active indicative, the aorist middle indicative, and the aorist passive indicative. So there were three distinct paradigms, right? Three distinct paradigms. What is that parallel to? Well, that's parallel to the future, right? The future had three distinct paradigms. The aorist has three distinct paradigms. Also, there was some other overlap there with the aorist. They both use a sigma. They both look at the action as a whole, from including beginning and ending and everything in between, just a simple, unmarked, unelaborated on presentation that it happened, right? I loosed. That's our gloss. It happened, right? I loosed. Okay? So now we have to learn the fifth of the five main tenses. It's also rightly, I think, thought of as a past tense, right? And that's the perfect. We're going to learn the perfect active indicative and the perfect middle passive indicative. The perfect active and the perfect middle passive. And you'll see there that there are just two paradigms to learn, just like the imperfect and just like the present. So if we wanted to, I'll just put this down here, right? There's a present active indicative, present middle passive indicative. There's an imperfect active indicative. There's an imperfect middle passive indicative. We're going to see there's a perfect active indicative. There's a perfect middle passive indicative. Do you see each one of those tenses, the present, the imperfect, and the perfect, has an active paradigm, and then it has a middle passive paradigm, middle passive paradigm, middle passive paradigm. That is different from the future, where there's a future active indicative, future middle indicative, future passive indicative, right? Three distinct paradigms, just as that is also the case with the aorist active indicative, aorist middle indicative, aorist passive indicative, right? That tense also, maybe visually seeing that together, you're like, okay, I can kind of see three of the main tenses, the present, the imperfect, and the perfect, have a shared middle passive paradigm, but the future and the aorist, they have distinct active, middle, and passive paradigms. We also make a little footnote that if a verb like paruomai, a verb that is middle only, that ends in that omai ending, it is going to follow middle or passive endings, but always conveying a middle idea. It will. So that's why sometimes one of my colleagues wants to call all of these paradigms, both middle or passive, he wants to label them medial passive, because in the Koine period, many times the passive paradigm will actually be conveying a middle idea. Okay, but that is not standard terminology, so we're not going to go that way. Okay, so we look at this chart again. Let's get it back on here, and we were talking about the perfect. What is the verbal aspect of the perfect, right? Because it's getting a little crowded here, but let's see if we can continue to. Let's use something like this. Okay, so the future, right, we talked about is that holistic perspective, just looking at it as a whole, or perfective aspect. The present, the imperfective aspect. The imperfect, the imperfective aspect. The aorist, that holistic or perfective aspect. What about the perfect? Well, the perfect is what is sometimes called the stative aspect. Some people have argued we should call it the combinative or aspect, but the standard terminology is the stative aspect. So this refers to the action being done in the past, right? It's completed, it's done, but then it has an abiding result into the present time frame, right? So if we think about, let me see if I can get this so we can see our time frames, right? This is the present, this is the past, right? It is done in the past, right? It's completed. It's completed. I think I should probably write stative aspect over in the present, because that's really where the emphasis is. But there's this ongoing stative aspect that has resulted from the prior action, right? There's an ongoing state, right? So completed action, but ongoing state that has resulted. The gloss that we use to translate the perfect in English is with the helping verb have or has with the past participle. So I have loosed, you have loosed, he has loosed, using have. there's not really a complete overlap between the Greek perfect and the English perfect. So don't misunderstand that. Don't equate them. Okay. Now I should say this is the standard way that this is taught, right? Completed action, abiding state or result. The more I've worked on the perfect the last few years and read about it, the more sort of complicated it's become to me. And I realized looking at perfects in the New Testament that this little simple explanation does not adequately explain all of them, right? I've especially read the work of a guy named Rutger Alan. He's a Dutch scholar, and this is supposed to be a mountain, okay? And he talks about how the perfect developed in Greek history. So rolling down the mountain sort of represents the Greek history. This is my illustration of his thesis. And he very convincingly shows how the perfect in older Greek had this idea of completed action, abiding result, and then as it rolled further down the hill in history, it picked up the idea not just of abiding result, but of relevance. Sometimes it conveyed the idea of relevance for the discourse that was going on, relevance for the discussion. So it assumes the action is done, but the issue is not its state, but its relevance for the ongoing discussion the author's having. And then eventually, it's used as you go further and further in time, and beginning, maybe as far back as the 2nd century BC, it begins to be used. 2nd century BC occasionally begins to be used. Basically synonymous with the aorist, just looking at the action as a whole, I'd say by the 5th century AD, long after the New Testament, it has become essentially synonymous with the aorist, and so eventually it just drops out. The perfect tense will disappear from the Greek language in the Byzantine period. And Rutger, let's try to say his name like the Dutch do, Rutger Alan, right? Rutger, it looks like Rutger Allen to me, but Rutger Alan, he argues, hey, the Greek in the New Testament, and again, this is my comparison, but essentially he's saying it's like a snowball. And as it's gone down, it's kept this core meaning of abiding resulting state, but it also sometimes has this idea of relevance, and it also has this aoristic or perfective aspect sometimes. It's a hybrid. In the Koine period, it does all three of these. And I as I read the New Testament, I say, wow, that actually describes the perfect tense as I read it in the New Testament, as opposed to oversimplifying it. Right? So I hope this is helpful because it's actually reflecting the usage in the New Testament. So I would say this is just approximations, right? That the abiding result or resulting state, how often does this occur? Well, the resulting state idea, which is the dominant way this is taught, usually the other ones are not, the state of result, probably covers about 55% of New Testament perfects. The idea of relevance for discourse unit, the ongoing relevance, is maybe about 35%. And then there are about 10% in the New Testament have that just holistic presentation of the action, essentially synonymous with the aorist. Okay, so let's keep going here, and let's look at the perfect. How do we actually form it? Okay, as you look up above here, this paradigm is the perfect, right? Perfect tense, active voice, indicative mood. Okay, so this is where the subject is doing the action. That's the active voice. Notice the I, the you, the he is the one doing this. Notice as well when we're translating it, see how it has the has or have helping verb, and then it has in English the past participle. Maybe you didn't know what that was called, but that's what it is. I have loosed, you have loosed, and so on. Now let's actually look at the layout of the chart here, right? Singular, plural, first, second, third person. You're used to that. And let's look at the Greek words here, okay? The Greek forms of the perfect. What do you see? Well, you see your stem there, right? The lu from luo, our good friend luo, right? There's your stem. What do you see that's different? Do you see an augment? No, you see something else. You see something called reduplication. Reduplication. You say, well, what is reduplication? Well, it's what it looks like, right? Reduplication is where you yank off the first consonant, like here it's a lambda, yank it off, and you stick an epsilon in. It's a way to stutter in Greek. And it's really delightful because it's very recognizable. It helps you find the perfect and recognize it very quickly. It's very unique, right? For example, if we have the verb pistuo, it would begin pepistu, right? We would have a reduplication with a pi, just so pepistu, lelu. And then also, notice we have a kappa. That's different. We haven't had that before. We have a kappa tense formative here at kappa, 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 kappa. We have kappas, okay? I tell students that kappa, think about it, looks like a K. 24K gold is perfect gold. 24 karat is perfect gold. So when you see that kappa, you should think to yourself, your default thinking, right? We realize there are always exceptions, but your default thinking should be, that's a perfect. If you'll notice, we really have the same endings that we had with the aorist at this point, with the alpha, and then just like the aorist, it uses an epsilon in the third singular. These alpha endings are exact. Think about it. Elusa. Let me just recite the aorist for you. Elusa, elusas, elusin, elusamen, elusata, elusan. So those are familiar. The alpha endings, alpha with the personal endings combined, those are the same as the aorist. Now there is this alternate form here, asen, lelukasen. Sometimes this form occurs and sometimes this form occurs. So there is a song that maybe you will use to help learn these, or maybe you will just rote memorize it. Maybe you'll just be leluka, lelukas, leluken, lelukaman, lelukata, lelukan, or kasen. Leluka, I have loosed. Lelukas, you have loosed. Leluken, he, she, or it has loosed. Lelukamen, we have loosed. Lelukate, you have loosed. Lelukasen is they have loosed, or that could also be in the Greek lelukan. And don't forget that that nu there is a movable nu in the third singular and the third person plural, so that may or may not be there. This form here that I'm underlining right now with red, that nu will be there for that form of the third person plural. But this other form, the nu is a movable nu. This is the active paradigm. You're like, well, what does the middle passive paradigm look like? Well, you're going to be glad because it's similar. We have the stem all the way through, just like we would expect. We have reduplication, right? We're glad for reduplication. And then we have our middle passive endings with no connecting vowel, right? You're used to seeing amatha or estha, right? But now you just have the, I'm marking off the connecting vowel, that you just have the metha and the stha, right? Metha, stha, ntai. And then you have here, right? You're used to the oh my, you're used to etai, but now you just have my and tai coming right up next to the stem. You do not have any connecting vowel. Maybe you're wondering about this. You're like, psi, I thought the ending was a. How do I end up with psi? Well, again, if we flew back in a time machine and we asked someone, why did you write psi rather than eta? They'd look at us and be like, because that's the way it's spelled, right? But we're not doing that. But if we study the history of the language, the morphology, historical morphology, we go back, we see, like, for example, with the present, right? Remember our good old present, luomai, lu a, luatai. What's going on here is you have lu plus the epsilon. Now, you never actually see this happen in real life, right? It's just you have the lu plus the epsilon connecting vowel plus the psi ending, okay? So that is the true ending here showing up. Well, what happened? Remember, in Greek, Greek does not like a sigma between two vowels, what's called the intervocalic sigma. So it drops out. These end up combining to be eta, and then the iota subscripts. So that's how we end up with the A, okay? It's actually combined vowels. This is the, quote, true ending, true second person singular ending showing up again. Let's make sure we know what we're doing here, right? This is the perfect middle / passive. Notice it could be middle or passive, middle passive indicative. The translation given here is just the passive. I have been loosed, you have been loosed, he has been loosed, we have been loosed, y'all have been loosed, they have been loosed. But this could also be rendered as a middle, right? It could also be rendered as a middle. Let me do that. I have loosed for myself, you have loosed for yourself, he has loosed for himself, we have loosed for ourselves, y'all have loosed for yourselves, they have loosed for themselves. Now, someone here, as few of you very astute students are asking yourself a question. You're wondering, what do I do if it begins with a vowel, like the verb akua? Do I yank the alpha off of the, is that, I haven't been studying Greek that long, but that does not look right. Well, your intuition is correct. In other words, what do you do when there's a vocalic reduplication? You're like, that's the question I had. What do you do if the word begins with a vowel and you want to reduplicate it? For example, the verb agapao, right? This is the contract verb I love. That's the artificial lexical form that we realize when we're memorizing it with a little piece of glass there between the contract vowel and the ending. And if we were to put this out in the real world, it would suddenly be agapo, right? I am loving. What does the perfect look like of that? Well, how handy of us to have it right next to it there, right? Yes, we have the kappa. Yes, we have the alpha endings, just like the aorist that we're used to seeing. Yes, we see our contract vowel lengthen when we add in a consonant, like we saw that with the aorist, right? The aorist would be agapesa, right? We would have the lengthened lengthened contract vowel. We'd have the sigma alpha, right? All that's the same. But then here, you notice what we have. Normally, when a verb begins with a vowel, rather than reduplicating, the initial vowel will just lengthen. So in other words, it won't look any different than if you were augmenting it. Someone's like, well, how am I going to know it's not an imperfect or an aorist? Because that looks just like the beginning of the imperfect in the aorist. You're going to know because the kappa, right, or some other change in spelling that's very distinctive. You're going to know because 24K gold is perfect gold. And if you have that kappa, you're saying to yourself, this is perfect. Someone else is asking, no one's asking this, right? You're not thinking this question, but we're going to throw it up here. What if the word begins with an aspirant letter, right? Remember, an aspirant letter is a letter where air is still escaping from your mouth. And you're like, I didn't have that question. Why would someone ask that? Well, try to say the perfect of this with puka, right? If you did it in a very regular way. You sound like the Tasmanian devil. You're spitting all over the microphone, right? It's hard to say two aspirant letters together because we spit on ourselves, and it's difficult to say. So what did the Greeks do? They used the cousin consonant of the aspirant letter to reduplicate. So if it was a phi, they would use a pi. So pepha, right? If it was a chi, they'd use a kappa. Keka. If it was a theta, they'd use a tau. Tetha, right? So the point is, if a verb begins with a phi, expect it to reduplicate with a pi. You're going to be just reading this. Don't misunderstand. That's reduplication. You're not going to be composing this. If a Greek verb begins with a chi, it's going to reduplicate with a kappa. If a Greek verb begins with a theta, it's going to reduplicate with a tau. So when we see these things, we realize that's reduplication. Okay? All right. What about if it's a compound verb? When we had compound verbs with the aorist or the imperfect, we saw that the augment came after the prepositional prefix. For example, apaluo, release or dismiss. Apelusa, right? The augment came here. It came after the prepositional prefix. Well, same sort of thing goes on with the perfect, right? The reduplication will come after the prepositional prefix. It will come before the main part of the verb, but after the prepositional prefix. For example, apaluo, I release. Apalelusai, right? Apalelusai would be the second person singular middle passive of that. So the reduplication would come before the main part of the verb. I think it would be helpful for us to parse that, right? So this is a perfect middle or passive indicative, second person singular. Rendered as a passive, it would be you have been released, right? Or you have been dismissed. You have been released. Rendered as a middle, it would be you have released for yourself. You have released for yourself. Now, katabino means I am going down. Katabebeka, notice this is the active, right? We have kappa, we have our reduplication. So parsing this would be a perfect, and I realize you haven't learned these paradigms yet most likely, but perfect, active, indicative, and that ending is first person singular. So it would be I have gone down. This is I am going down, katabaino, katabe beka. I have gone down, right? I have gone down. And the idea, right, what we're thinking, probably this means most of the time, the person went down in the past, but there's some ongoing state that has resulted from that. Now maybe they're talking about going down to live in a village next to the sea. Now the resulting state is they're there. They're in a state of being someone who lives in that village, or perhaps it has some ongoing relevance, immediate relevance for what's said after that. All right. Again, we're just looking at, in this example, just looking at how compound verbs will reduplicate after their prepositional prefix. You know, there are going to be a few verbs that just kind of buck the trend. We could call them irregular perfects. We could call them second perfects. And the more common ones you just want to try to recognize. For example, erkamai, the perfect of that is elelutha. Now that looks a little bit similar to some of the sounds in the second aorist, but it's also quite distinct, right? And you're using a theta rather than a kappa. Many of these irregular perfects are using a different letter rather than a kappa before the ending. They still have notice how they all still follow the alpha endings. Some of them have reduplication on the beginning, but not all of them, right? So that's why we're calling these irregulars. These are listed in the book, and you just want to, as much as you can, try to focus on recognizing those. We're not asking you to rote memorize those. A couple more things we have to talk about. One, we have to talk about the pluperfect, right? The pluperfect, a sixth tense in the New Testament. This is the pluperfect active indicative paradigm, and we're not asking you to memorize this. You just some grammars essentially even put it in a footnote. So, but we are including it here. And we're not going to fill out that whole chart, right? But in the chart of the past, the present, and the future, where does this fit? Well, if we were to add another thing, the pre-past, the earlier past, we would be saying this act. We're in a discourse. We're talking about the past, and we're looking back and saying this happened earlier in the past, and there was some abiding state into that past time frame in which we're talking. We're taking what would be the perfect, right? The perfect is this, and we're kicking it back one notch further in time, and so this is the pluperfect. Again, just to restate that, I don't want to be confusing. We're speaking in a past time frame. We're existing or speaking in the past time frame, and we're speaking about something then earlier that was completed in an earlier past time frame, but has abiding significance or has the resulting state into the past time frame in which we're primarily dealing with. So we translate that in English with the word had. I had loosed, you had loosed, he had loosed, we had loosed, y'all had loosed, they had loosed, right? That's different from the perfect, which is have or has, right? And what do you see here that's similar to the perfect, right? What do you see that's similar? Well, you see kappas, right? Which usually is a sign of 24K perfect gold. You see reduplication, right? You see also an augment, right? That's past time reference, kicking it back one further notch in the past. The augment is not always there, but you're like, well, if it's not always there, how do I know it's perfect? Well, you're also going to know because of this distinctive diphthong here, right? It does not use the alpha endings. It's lelukain, lelukase, leluke, lelukamen, leluketa, lelukason. Again, you're not even really being asked to recognize this. You're just being exposed. You're being exposed to this, like being exposed to some sort of germ. You're inoculating yourself against it. Just being aware of it, reading it, thinking about it for a moment, and moving on pretty rapidly. Okay. The final thing we have to survey in this lecture is the verb oida. Okay, the verb oida. It's covered in this chapter because it's a strange word. You learned it as a vocabulary word in the previous chapter. And when you memorize the vocabulary word oida, you're actually memorizing a perfect form, right? It's perfect in form, but it's present in meaning, right? It's come by the Koine period to essentially be synonymous. It's essentially synonymous with gnosko. They're used interchangeably by John frequently in his writings. So you will notice you have here your perfect endings with the alpha, right? We saw those in the paradigm, as, in, and ata, on. Otherwise, it's going to appear quite irregular. There's no kappa, there's no visible reduplication that we can see, or things like that. But it's essentially just translated like gnosko. I know, you know, he knows, we know, y'all know, they know. This is a very common word. Oida is a very common word, so you need to be aware of it. If I say parse oida, you can parse it as a perfect active indicative, or you can parse it, I think that would be better to parse it that way, because that's technically what the form is. But you need to recognize it's not translated, I have known. It's just translated, I know, just a pure stative idea of knowing without any real prominence to some prior point of coming to know, or something like that. The pluperfect of oida also appears in the New Testament, and it's essentially synonymous with the aorist, right? The pluperfect we're rendering just as sort of a holistic past. I knew, you knew, he knew, we knew, y'all knew, they knew. And these are the forms. You can see it has that epsilon iota there between the personal ending and the stem, just like we saw in the pluperfect paradigm. It has the same endings here, ain, ace, a, amen, ate, ason. So I would probably ask you to memorize Adane as I knew, and know that's the pluperfect, and just be aware that you might see it in some of the other persons and numbers very, very rarely. So here we are, the perfect chapter. Embrace it.